Kyle Busch's Atlanta race did not just end in a crash. It ended with him pointing fingers directly at Trackhouse Racing and Ross Chastain in a way that made the entire garage go quiet. And what he said after is still causing problems nobody saw coming. Kyle Busch did not just lose a race at Atlanta, he lost his patience. And when Kyle Busch loses his patience, he does not whisper about it, he says exactly what he means, exactly who he means it about, and he does not care who is standing close enough to hear it. The contact came from Ross Chastain, that part is not debated. Midway through the race, Chastain's Trackhouse Racing Chevrolet made contact with Busch's Richard Childress racing car in a moment that looked aggressive, felt intentional to everyone watching, and ended Busch's entire afternoon in one shot. The damage was too much. The day was done. And Kyle Busch had to sit in that garage and watch the rest of the race from the wrong side of the wall. You could feel the temperature change the moment he climbed out of that car. This was not the frustration of a bad pit stop or a mechanical failure. This was something more personal. This was a driver who has been around long enough to know the difference between a racing incident and a choice, and he had already made up his mind about which one this was, and then he said it. It is just what they all do. They just run through you. That one sentence, think about it. He did not say Chastain made a mistake. He did not say it was a tough racing situation. He said they, plural, like this is a pattern, like Trackhouse Racing has a culture, like Ross Chastain is not some lone aggressive driver, but a product of an environment that allows this kind of racing. That is a direct shot. That is Kyle Busch telling the world that the problem is bigger than one corner at Atlanta. Now here is where it gets interesting, because Busch has been around this sport for over 2 decades. He has wrecked people. He has been wrecked by people. He knows how this game works better than almost anyone still strapping into a car every Sunday. When a driver with that resume looks at a camera after a race and says something that pointed, that specific, that calm is the scary part. By the way, because he was not screaming, he was just stating a fact. You have to take it seriously. Richard Childress Racing took it seriously. The team was visibly frustrated at Atlanta, and the people around Busch were not doing much to hide it either. This was not a situation where the crew chief goes on the radio and says, "We will get them next week." The energy in that garage was heavier than that. Something shifted at Atlanta, and it was not just the standings. Here is the thing about Ross Chastain and contact. This is not the first time his name has appeared in a conversation that starts with the words, "He just ran through somebody." His entire reputation in this sport is built on the edge between aggressive and reckless, and depending on which side of the wall you are standing on, you see it completely differently. Trackhouse Racing fans call it fearless. The drivers on the receiving end call it something else entirely. And Kyle Busch just called it out louder than anyone has this season. Now before we get into what Trackhouse Racing said and what Chastain did next, because that part of the story is just as wild. If you are the kind of fan who wants to actually talk about this stuff, instead of just watching highlights and moving on, you are in the right place. Hit that like button because this channel covers the stories that actually matter inside the garage, not just the box scores. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because what is coming in the next part of this story is the part that the mainstream coverage completely missed. There is something happening inside the Trackhouse Racing garage in response to Busch's comments that changes the entire context of what he said at Atlanta. And there is a pattern with Chastain that other teams have been talking about quietly, very quietly, until now, because Kyle Busch just said it out loud, and now nobody can pretend they did not hear it. Ross Chastain did not apologize. Let that sink in. Kyle Busch goes on camera, names your team, calls out your driving style in front of the entire NASCAR world, and your response is essentially nothing. No statement, no walkover to the RCR hauler. No radio message passed through crew chiefs, the way drivers sometimes handle these things when they want to keep it professional. Chastain moved on like Atlanta was just another race day, and Busch's comments were just another opinion. That is either extreme confidence or extreme disrespect. And depending on what you know about the history between these two, you probably already have a strong feeling about which one it is. Here is the thing about Ross Chastain that casual fans sometimes miss. The aggression is not random. It is not panic driving or desperation moves from someone who does not know what he is doing. Chastain is calculated in a way that makes the contact almost harder to deal with. Because you cannot prove intent, NASCAR cannot penalize a feeling, and by the time the replays are being analyzed, he is already 3 laps ahead and racing clean. The incident at Atlanta followed that exact pattern. Contact, damage to the other car, Chastain continues, race goes on. Kyle Busch has seen that pattern before. That is exactly why his words after Atlanta carried the weight they did. He was not reacting emotionally in the heat of the moment. He waited, he thought about it, and then he said, "It is just what they all do, they just run through you," which means he had already connected the dots before the microphone was in his face. Now Trackhouse Racing's official response was careful, professionally careful. The kind of careful that tells you someone in that organization knew the comments were serious enough to require a measured answer. They did not defend Chastain aggressively. They did not attack Busch. They essentially said it was a racing incident and everyone moves forward. Clean, controlled. Designed to close the story down as fast as possible. But here is what nobody is talking about yet. 3 other teams have had internal conversations this season about Chastain's driving, not public statements, not media comments. Private conversations at the track level, between crew chiefs and team managers, about whether there needs to be a more formal process for flagging this kind of contact with NASCAR before it becomes a bigger problem. Those conversations have stayed quiet because nobody wants to be the team that starts a political war with Trackhouse Racing during a championship season. But Kyle Busch just blew that quiet wide open. Because when a 2-time Cup Series champion with his experience stands in front of cameras and says what Busch said, it gives every other team in that garage permission to say it too. That is the part Trackhouse Racing should be genuinely concerned about, not the headline. Not the one-day news cycle. The permission structure that Busch just created for every driver and every team that has bitten their tongue about Chastain all season long. Think about what that means going forward. Atlanta was one race. There are tracks coming up on this schedule where aggressive door-to-door racing is not just possible, it is guaranteed. Bristol, Talladega, Darlington. Every single one of those venues is a place where the difference between a racing incident and a wrecked season is about 3 inches of sheet metal. And now every driver on that starting grid knows exactly how Kyle Busch feels about the way Chastain operates in those situations. Richard Childress Racing knows it too. The team has been building something with Busch this season that requires momentum, requires clean finishes, requires points. A DNF at Atlanta because of contact that Busch clearly believes was avoidable. That does not just hurt the standings. It damages the trust between a driver and a team that is still finding its rhythm together. When Busch says they just run through you, he is also saying, quietly, underneath the anger, that he needed his team to protect him from that situation, and somehow the situation still happened. That is the part of this story that Richard Childress Racing has to answer. Not to the media, not to the fans, to Kyle Busch, directly, and right now, nobody outside that hauler knows what that conversation looked like. Here is the bigger picture that nobody wants to say directly, but everybody in that garage is already thinking. Kyle Busch is not a young driver with 15 years ahead of him to absorb bad luck and rebuild. He is a veteran in the back half of his career, driving for a team in Richard Childress Racing that needs wins as badly as he does. Every race that ends early because of someone else's decision-making is not just a lost Sunday. It is a lost opportunity that does not come back. The schedule does not pause. The points do not wait. And at this stage of Busch's career, the margin for wasted days is razor thin. That is what makes Atlanta hurt more than a normal DNF. This was not a tire failure. This was not weather. This was contact from a specific driver at a specific team that Busch clearly believes operates with a specific philosophy, and that philosophy just cost him a result he needed. Now look at what Richard Childress Racing actually has to work with going forward. They have a driver whose frustration is now public. They have a target on their car from a comment that Ross Chastain and Trackhouse Racing absolutely heard and will absolutely remember the next time they are racing side by side. And they have a championship fight that requires them to keep their head down and stack clean finishes, which becomes significantly harder when the emotional temperature between your driver and another team is running this hot. Because here is the reality of NASCAR that fans understand, but television coverage rarely explains properly. These drivers are not strangers who meet at the track on Sunday and forget each other on Monday. They travel the same circuit. They share the same garage spaces week after week. The tension between Kyle Busch and Ross Chastain does not disappear when the checkered flag drops at the next race. It walks into that garage with both of them. It sits in the pre-race meetings. It shows up on the radio when their cars are running 3 feet apart at 200 miles an hour. You could feel that tension already building at Atlanta even before the contact happened. That is the part the broadcast missed. The racing between these two earlier in that race had an edge to it that experienced fans recognized immediately. The contact was almost inevitable by the time it arrived, not because either driver is reckless, but because two people who do not fully trust each other sharing the same piece of racetrack is always going to end one way eventually. And it did. Let that sink in. This is not a one-race story. This is a season-long pressure point that just got its first major release at Atlanta, and pressure points that release once almost always build again. The question that nobody can answer right now is what happens the next time these two are racing for position late in a race that actually matters for the championship. Because Chastain is not going to drive differently. His entire value to Trackhouse Racing is built on the fact that he does not lift when other drivers might. That is not going to change because Kyle Busch went on camera after Atlanta, and Busch is not going to forget what happened. Drivers with his experience and his pride do not file incidents like this under move on. They file them under remember. So what does NASCAR do if this escalates? Because right now the sanctioning body has not said a word about the Atlanta contact publicly. No review announced. No statement about the incident, which means officially, as far as NASCAR is concerned, Atlanta was a racing incident and everybody moves forward. But does Kyle Busch move forward? Does Richard Childress Racing move forward? Or does Atlanta become the moment that defined the entire dynamic between these two teams for the rest of the 2026 season? That question does not have an answer yet, and that is exactly what makes it uncomfortable. Where do you land on this? Was Chastain's move at Atlanta a legitimate race move, or was Busch right to call it out the way he did? Drop it in the comments, because this conversation is worth having properly. If this kind of real garage-level NASCAR coverage is what you come here for, hit like and make sure you are subscribed, because the story between these two is nowhere near finished, and you do not want to be the person who missed what comes next.